Hey guys, tonight we're starting something that's equal parts strange, a little sad, and honestly kind of ridiculous. So, dim the lights, settle into that pillow, and let your brain just drift while we wander through the ways people in the past thought they were treating women as anxiety. Spoiler, they weren't really treating it. They were just projecting their own ideas about what women should or shouldn't be. And of course, before you get too comfortable, maybe tap that like button and subscribe. But only if this is the kind of history you enjoy. I always love seeing where people are tuning in from. So drop a comment with your city or country. It's kind of fun to imagine this sleepy little community stretched out across the globe. Now, imagine it's the ancient world. You're a woman feeling restless, overwhelmed, or just, human. But unfortunately, your feelings don't get to exist as just feelings. Nope, they get filed under something called hysteria. And if you think that word sounds dismissive now, that's because it was literally designed to be. The Greek word hystera means uterus. And yes, you're already sensing where this is going. For centuries, if a woman showed signs of anxiety, sadness, irritability, or even just boredom, doctors blamed it on her wandering womb. Supposedly, the uterus would just get up, roam around her body like it was lost in a shopping mall, and cause chaos wherever it went. Anxiety. Clearly your uterus is pressing on your heart. Shortness of breath. Must be your uterus pushing on your lungs. Mood swings. Oh, obviously the uterus has floated up near your brain. Because apparently, that was the kind of medical logic we were working with. And the cures? Well, they ranged from the silly to the invasive. One option was fumigation. A woman might be made to sit over pleasant-smelling herbs to lure the uterus back down, or over unpleasant smells at her nose to drive it away from the brain. Basically, the womb was treated like a confused little animal that needed to be coaxed back to its pen. Ancient gynecology was less about science and more about playing shepherd to your own organs. Of course, marriage and sex were also prescribed, because, why not? If a woman was anxious or restless, the cure was often presented as, get married, have children, end quote, satisfy the womb, which is convenient for husbands, less convenient for women, who maybe just wanted a nap. And here's the thing, this idea never really went away. The notion of female anxiety being tied to reproduction lasted well into the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and even the 19th century. You'd think after 1,000 years someone would stop and go, maybe women are just stressed because life is hard. But no, the wandering uterus stuck around like that one embarrassing family myth no one ever corrects. So, let's float forward a few centuries into medieval Europe. Picture the setting: monasteries, manuscripts, and a lot of men with opinions about women they had never actually spoken to. Anxiety and nervousness were still bundled under hysteria. Treatments included diet, bleeding, purges, and sometimes prayer. Because, of course, if you were nervous, clearly you needed fewer bodily fluids and more church. And yet, even within these systems, there's a strange tenderness. Medieval doctors wrote about women's suffering in ways that show they recognized it was real. They just didn't have the framework to understand it. So they stuck with their old favorite. The womb did it. Fast forward again to the Renaissance. Doctors were obsessed with balance the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. If you were anxious, clearly your humors were out of whack. Too much black bile, congratulations, you're melancholic. Too much phlegm, guess you're sluggish and sad. It's not exactly modern psychology, but it's fascinating how much effort went into categorizing emotions without ever once considering, women as people with interior lives beyond their bodies. And here's where the dry irony really shines. Men with anxiety were usually described as melancholic, intellectual, even poetic. Women with anxiety, hysterical, irrational, unbalanced. Same symptoms, totally different spin. It's almost like gender bias has been around for a while. Shocking, I know. Let's drift ahead a little more. Because by the 18th and 19th centuries, hysteria became practically a fashion trend. Parisian doctors like Jean-Martin Charcot would hold demonstrations of hysterical women in lecture halls, as if their panic attacks and seizures were theater. Students would gather, take notes, and applaud. Anxiety became entertainment, which is equal parts sad and surreal. And of course, Sigmund Freud later entered the scene with his theories of repression and sexuality. According to Freud, women's anxiety came from, well, basically, not having enough sex or not processing their desires correctly. Which is one way to frame things, I guess. Not the best way, but hey, he was consistent. So yeah, from wandering wombs to Freud's couch, women's anxiety has been explained away, dramatized, and pathologized in every way except the simplest one. Acknowledging that being alive, especially as a woman, in restrictive societies, is stressful. So, let's move into the 18th and 19th centuries, where things got fancy. This was the golden age of fainting couches, smelling salts, and novels where the heroine inevitably swoons at least twice before the end of chapter 5. Anxiety, at this point, wasn't just a condition, it was practically a fashion accessory. Especially if you were upper class. Picture it, women in corsets, so tight you can't breathe, drinking tea laced with lead-based glazes, strolling through coal-smoke air, and being told daily that your main purpose in life is to look pretty merry strategically and not embarrass the family. And then, when you feel a little shaky or lightheaded, congratulations, you're diagnosed with nerves, which, to be fair, is not entirely inaccurate. Doctors in England and France especially loved talking about nervous disorders in women. The term covered everything from actual panic attacks to mild boredom. Feeling restless, that's your nerves. Can't sleep, nerves. Don't want to marry your cousin, definitely nerves. The Cure, a mixture of gentle condescension, expensive tonics, and endless instructions to rest more. And rest, by the way, was rarely restful. One of the most notorious cures was something called the rest cure, made famous by American physician Silas Weir Mitchell. If you've ever read Charlotte Perkins Gilman's short story, The Yellow Wallpaper, you already know where this is going. The idea was that if a woman was anxious, depressed, or otherwise mentally unwell, the cure was to isolate her in a quiet room, forbid her from working, reading, or writing, and feed her rich, fatty foods until she gained weight. The logic was, no stimulation equals recovery. In reality, women went stir-crazy. Gilman herself underwent the treatment, hated every second, and then wrote The Yellow Wallpaper as a horror story inspired by it. And it really is horrifying, not in a dramatic jump scare way, but in that slow, suffocating, no one is listening to me way, which, again, was basically the lived experience of a lot of women with anxiety. Meanwhile, men with nerves got a different prescription entirely. They were encouraged to travel, go hunting, take up invigorating hobbies, or even dabble in philosophy. Women got locked in bedrooms. Men got vacations. Nothing says equality like two wildly different approaches to the same condition. But it wasn't just gender, it was also class. Poor women didn't usually get diagnosed with hysteria or nerves, because no one was paying doctors to analyze them. They were just called lazy, difficult, or sinful. Wealthy women, on the other hand, could afford elaborate treatments, spas, and medical attention, so nervous disorders became something of a fashionable illness associated with refinement and delicacy. Because what better way to show you re-upper class than by being too fragile to exist without collapsing? Smelling salts, by the way, were a huge part of this culture. A little bottle of ammonia-based salts carried in a dainty pouch. If you felt faint, you just sniffed, jolted awake, and everyone nodded knowingly. It was both medical tool and accessory like the 19th century equivalent of carrying around an emotional support water bottle. And then there were the tonics. Oh, the tonics. Anxiety was often treated with soothing syrups, which usually contained opium, alcohol, or both. Perfect bedtime cocktail. Mothers gave it to fussy children, doctors gave it to anxious women, and everyone acted surprised when people got addicted. The Victorians were basically handing out opioids like party favors, then writing long essays about how society was collapsing. By the late 19th century, some women started to push back. Writers like Gilman, activists like Elizabeth Packard, and later suffragists argued that being trapped in a system that limited their freedom was itself the cause of anxiety. Imagine that. It wasn't tea, your wandering womb, or your fragile nerves. It was the fact that you had no control over your own life. Revolutionary thought, apparently. Still, the medical world was slow to catch on. Well into the early 20th century, women with anxiety were being institutionalized for conditions that today would be treated with therapy and medication. Husbands could sign the papers, doctors would nod, and off you went to a sanatorium. Sometimes for a rest cure, sometimes indefinitely. So, when we talk about women's anxiety in history, it's not just about medicine, it's about power. Who had the power to define emotions as illness? And who had the power to prescribe the cure? And spoiler, it was almost never the women themselves. So, let's slide gently into the late 19th and early 20th century. This is the era when psychology as we know it was just being born. Picture crowded Viennese lecture halls, men in waistcoats stroking their beards, and women being used as case studies rather than, people. Enter Sigmund Freud. You've definitely heard the name. He's the guy who made couches famous, though to be fair, his patients weren't. Reclining on chic, modern sectionals, they were usually lying stiffly on what looked like a Victorian daybed. Freud was fascinated by hysteria, which, as we've already seen, was the umbrella term for women's anxiety, depression, trauma, or basically anything that didn't fit neatly into a male doctor's worldview. Now, Freud wasn't working in a vacuum. He had studied under Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris, the one who turned hysteria into a public performance. Charcot would have women with seizures and tremors displayed in lecture halls, like human exhibits. Students scribbled notes while the women convulsed. It was medicine, sure, but also theater, and Freud carried some of that energy with him when he returned to Vienna. For Freud, hysteria wasn't about a wandering uterus anymore. Progress, I guess, but it was still deeply tied to sexuality. He argued that women's anxiety often came from repressed desires, childhood traumas, or conflicts in the subconscious. If you were a woman in Freud's Vienna, your panic attack was less about living in a rigid, patriarchal society and more about, well, your dad, or your unresolved Oedipal conflicts, or the fact that you hadn't properly sublimated your libido. So, congratulations, anxiety. You are now a matter of repressed psychic energy. Freud put a fancy vocabulary around it, but in practice, women were still being told their suffering was a symptom of their bodies or their relationships with men. And what was the cure? Talk. Lots of talk. Freud encouraged patients to speak freely while reclining on his famous couch, with him sitting out of sight so they could project their thoughts without distraction. This was the birth of psychoanalysis. On the surface, it was more humane than being locked in a sanatorium or bled with leeches. But of course, the framework was still tilted. Women's words were filtered through Freud's theories, which almost always circled back to sexuality. There's a dark humor here. Imagine being a woman in 1900, anxious, because you're trapped in a stifling marriage, isolated from education, and forbidden from meaningful work. You tell Freud you feel suffocated. He nods thoughtfully and says, yes, it must be because of your unresolved desire for your father. It's almost comical, if it weren't so frustrating. Freud's ideas, though, spread like wildfire. Hysteria became a case study in early psychiatry. Middle-class women in Europe and America were flocking to doctors to discuss their nerves, their dreams, their suppressed emotions. It gave them a kind of strange visibility. They were studied, analyzed, written about. But visibility isn't the same as validation. Their stories were turned into data points in male-driven theories. Interestingly, Freud eventually shifted. He began to argue that hysteria wasn't exclusively a female condition. Men, too, could suffer from repressed anxieties that manifested physically. This was groundbreaking at the time because it cracked open the idea that anxiety wasn't just a woman's weakness. But of course, when men experienced it, the framing was different. Men were neurotic intellectuals. Women were still hysterical. Same symptoms, same underlying causes, very different branding. And then came World War I, which forced psychiatry to look at anxiety in a new way. Thousands of soldiers returned from the front with what was then called shell shock, nightmares, tremors, panic, and breakdowns. Suddenly, anxiety wasn't just a woman's disorder tied to wounds and nerves. It was a human reaction to unbearable stress. Freud himself studied war neuroses, but the cultural shift was bigger than him. So, if you're tracing the arc, ancient doctors said anxiety came from a wandering uterus. Medieval doctors said it came from unbalanced humors. Renaissance doctors said it came from your temperament. 19th century doctors said it came from fragile nerves. Freud said it came from repressed desires. And the world wars finally said, maybe, just maybe, anxiety is the normal result of terrible experiences. Revolutionary. But, of course, that didn't stop hysteria from lingering in the background. Even into the mid-20th century, women who expressed too much emotion could still be slapped with the label. Husbands could still have wives institutionalized for being nervous. Doctors still prescribed sedatives without listening. The language evolved, but the power dynamics stayed pretty steady. And here's the ironic twist. Freud's couch became a cultural icon. Therapy, once seen as something shameful, became fashionable among certain elites. By the mid-century, Hollywood stars and writers were all about psychoanalysis. But women, they were still far more likely to be labeled hysterical, medicated, and dismissed. Even while the culture praised the brilliance of male patients unraveling their anxieties on the very same couches. It's a pattern that doesn't really end. Anxiety keeps changing labels, keeps getting medicalized differently depending on who has it, and keeps reflecting the culture more than the actual lived experience of the person suffering. So now we drift into the mid-20th century, a world shaped by World War II and its aftermath. By this point, the wandering womb had finally retired, and Freud's influence was beginning to fade, though his ghost still haunted psychiatry. Anxiety was no longer framed entirely as hysteria, but let's just say the way it was treated still had a very gendered slant. World War II had changed everything. Millions of men came home with what was first called battle fatigue or combat neurosis. Doctors couldn't just sweep it under the rug anymore. Anxiety, depression, and breakdowns weren't confined to fainting ladies. They were happening to toughened soldiers too. And suddenly, there was a whole new urgency to understand these conditions. But while men's anxiety was treated as a medical and even patriotic problems, something caused by the horrors of war, women's anxiety still got the same old treatment. Domestic explanations. If you were a woman in the 1940s or 50s, and you felt restless or overwhelmed, the common medical opinion was that you were simply struggling to adjust to your natural role as a wife and mother. The problem wasn't the role itself, of course. It was you. And then came the miracle cure of the era. Tranquilizers, Valium, Librium, and a host of other sedatives hit the market in the 1950s and 60s, heavily marketed toward women. Magazine ads literally called them the solution to the housewife's problem. Imagine glossy spreads showing a smiling woman in pearls, effortlessly juggling housework thanks to her daily pill. Anxiety wasn't seen as a signal that something was wrong with her environment or her life choices. No, it was a sign she needed a prescription. These drugs were called Mother's Little Helpers. And yes, that's where the Rolling Stones got the song title. They were so common that a huge portion of suburban women were quietly medicated, their very real frustration and anxiety dulled into submission. The message was simple. Don't change your life, just change your brain chemistry. And of course, the irony is rich. Men coming home with war trauma were treated as heroes in need of healing. Women stuck in suffocating domestic routines were treated as problems in need of pills. Both groups were anxious, but one was respected for it. The other was quietly tranquilized. The 1950s image of the happy housewife was, in many ways, a pharmaceutical construction. Behind those smiles were countless women numbing their dissatisfaction with pills handed out like candy by doctors. And if that didn't work, there was always electroconvulsive therapy or institutionalization, still lurking in the background as fallback options. Now, it's not that tranquilizers were always bad. For some women, they genuinely did bring relief. Anxiety can be crippling, and medication can help. But the problem was the larger framing. Society wasn't asking why women were so anxious. It wasn't considering that maybe being trapped in rigid gender roles, with no autonomy, no career, and no outlet, might be a root cause. Instead, the problem was medicalized, isolated, and neatly packaged in a pill bottle. Meanwhile, psychiatry itself was evolving. By the 1960s, diagnoses were being reorganized into manuals like the DSM-DA Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Anxiety disorders were starting to be separated from hysteria, which was finally disappearing as a diagnostic category. In some ways, progress. But the lingering habit of dismissing women's anxiety as overreaction or weakness didn't vanish overnight. Spoiler, it still hasn't. And then, as the 60s and 70s rolled in, something big started happening. Women themselves began pushing back, not just in medicine, but in society. The feminist movement gave language to the dissatisfaction so many housewives had been numbing with tranquilizers. Betty Friedan famously called it the problem that has no name, the deep gnawing anxiety and emptiness that came from being told your entire life's purpose was vacuuming and making casseroles. So in a way, anxiety became political. It wasn't just a private struggle anymore, it was a collective experience, rooted in social structures, not just in brain chemistry or fragile nerves. And for the first time in centuries, women themselves were publicly reframing the conversation. Not wandering wombs, not humors, not hysteria. Just the reality of living under restrictions that suffocated the mind. Of course, doctors didn't suddenly throw out their pill bottles. Tranquilizers remained the go-to prescription well into the 70s. But the cultural narrative was starting to shift. Anxiety was no longer just a personal failing. It was beginning to be recognized as something bigger, shaped by the world itself. So, by the time we hit the 1970s, the world of mental health was shifting again. The feminist movement was in full swing. Women were questioning their roles more openly, and psychiatry itself was under the microscope. Anxiety was no longer just something whispered about in the doctor's office. It was starting to be debated in magazines, on talk shows, and in the broader culture. The rest cure had faded. The fainting couch was out. But guess what stuck around? Pills. Always pills. Tranquilizers were still widely prescribed, but they were increasingly seen as problematic. Overuse, dependency, and the nagging question of whether doctors were just drugging women into silence. Feminist writers weren't shy about pointing this out. They argued that medicalizing women's unhappiness was just another way of keeping them quiet. If your entire life is suffocating, you don't need sedation, you need change. This critique wasn't just social, it was also medical. Psychiatrists themselves were starting to rethink the category of hysteria. By the DSM-3 in 1980, hysteria had officially been dropped as a diagnosis. Instead, conditions like generalized anxiety disorder, panic disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder were being recognized. A major shift. Women's anxiety wasn't just dismissed as vague nerves anymore. It was being categorized, studied, and finally taken a little more seriously. But let's not over-romanticize it. The 1970s and 80s were also the heyday of therapy fads. Encounter groups, primal scream therapy, endless talk therapy sessions. Suburban couples would gather in circles to yell their frustrations, as if shouting in someone's living room could cure centuries of gender depression. And maybe it helped some people. But for a lot of women, it was just another performance of their pain, without much structural change. And then came the Prozac era. By the late 1980s and 1990s, antidepressants became the new frontier. Prozac hit the market in 1987, and it was marketed as a miracle drug for depression and anxiety. Unlike tranquilizers, which dulled emotions, Prozac promised to lift the fog. Magazine covers declared it the dawn of a new age. Doctors loved it, patients asked for it, and the culture embraced it. Elizabeth Wurtzel even wrote Prozac Nation in 1994, capturing the mood of a generation medicated into stability. For women, this was both progress and repetition. On the one hand, Prozac and other SSRIs were less addictive than tranquilizers, and they genuinely helped many people live better lives. On the other hand, the same old story played out. Women were still more likely than men to be diagnosed with anxiety and depression, and more likely to be medicated for it. Was it biology, social roles, or just a reflection of who society allowed to admit vulnerability? Hard to say. Probably all three. Meanwhile, therapy itself was becoming mainstream. The image of the patient stretched out on a couch talking to a serious man in glasses was slowly replaced by the idea of therapy as self-care. Women in the 80s and 90s were encouraged to find themselves in therapy, even while ads still quietly pushed pharmaceuticals as the fastest solution. It was a double message. Talk about your problems, but also take a pill so you can keep functioning in the same system that causes them. Feminist critiques kept growing louder. Writers like Phyllis Chesler pointed out how psychiatry pathologized women's perfectly rational anger and stress. If you were a man shouting about injustice, you might be called passionate or political. If you were a woman doing the same, you might be called anxious, neurotic, or unstable. The labels changed, but the bias lingered. And let's not forget how pop culture framed it. Think of movies and TV in the 90s. Women in therapy were often portrayed as quirky, neurotic, or a little unhinged. Men in therapy, brooding intellectuals. Again, same behavior, different spin. By the 90s, Prozac was joined by Zoloft, Paxil, and others. A whole new pharmacy shelf of SSRIs. Anxiety and depression were increasingly medicalized as chemical imbalances, which, to be fair, is partially true. But it also had the effect of flattening complex social problems into neurotransmitter issues. Stressed out because you're working a double shift, raising kids, and dealing with systemic sexism. Don't worry, here's a prescription. Problem solved. Except, not really. The late 20th century was when people started to realize that medication alone wasn't enough. Therapy, community, and systemic change mattered too. But systemic change is hard. Writing prescriptions is easy. And so the pattern continued. What's striking is how each era wrapped women's anxiety in the language of its time. Ancient wounds, medieval humors, Victorian nerves, Freud's subconscious, tranquilizers in the 50s, Prozac in the 90s. Different words, different treatments, same undercurrent. Women's suffering being reframed in ways that rarely gave them full control. And that's really the running theme. Anxiety itself hasn't changed all that much. What's changed is the packaging, the metaphors, the cures that reflect more about the society than about the actual women living through it. So now we float into the 2000s and beyond, where women's anxiety didn't exactly vanish, it just got rebranded yet again. This is the age of self-care hashtags, mindfulness apps, and therapy sessions conducted over Zoom. And while it's easy to say things are better now, it's worth looking at how the story has both changed and stayed the same. First off, diagnosis. By the early 2000s, anxiety disorders were among the most common mental health diagnoses in the world. Generalized anxiety, social anxiety, panic disorder, these weren't fringe terms anymore. They were in everyday conversation. In some ways, that's progress. Talking openly about anxiety became less taboo, especially for women. Magazines started running pieces about high-functioning anxiety. Celebrities admitted to their struggles. Suddenly, saying you had anxiety wasn't a shameful secret. It was almost a rite of passage. But with recognition came commercialization. Enter the wellness industry. Anxiety wasn't just something to manage with therapy or medication anymore. It was a market. Essential oils for calming, weighted blankets, adult coloring books, yoga retreats in Bali. The idea wasn't just to treat anxiety, but to buy your way out of it, one scented candle at a time. And while some of these things genuinely help, weighted blankets are great. No sarcasm there. The larger trend blurred the line between care and consumerism. And then came social media. Instagram especially turned mental health into a kind of aesthetic. Pastel graphics with affirmations. It's okay to not be okay. Carousel posts breaking down anxiety symptoms. Influencers building whole brands on vulnerability. Therapy speak words like boundaries, trauma, and triggered started floating around in captions and tweets. Sometimes accurately, sometimes not. Anxiety went from something whispered in a doctor's office to something shared publicly with There's irony here too. The very platforms that amplify anxiety, constant scrolling, comparison. The dopamine hit of likes are the same platforms where advice about healing gets shared. Social media became both the cause and the supposed cure, all wrapped into one endless feed. Meanwhile, therapy itself went digital. Apps like BetterHelp and Talkspace promised access to counseling from your phone. Suddenly, therapy was marketed like Uber, available on demand, subscription-based, and convenient. For women juggling jobs, childcare, and the general chaos of life, this was a lifeline. But it also commodified therapy in ways that raised eyebrows. Your mental health became part of the gig economy, subject to the same algorithms as food delivery. And let's not forget medication. SSRIs and anti-anxiety drugs remained staples, but now they were often paired with therapy and lifestyle changes. The conversation had broadened. Instead of just take a pill, it became take a pill, but also try yoga, mindfulness, journaling, and gratitude practices, which is great in theory, but also exhausting. Imagine being told your cure for anxiety is basically a part-time job of wellness rituals. Feminist critiques didn't stop either. Scholars pointed out that women were still more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety than men, partly because they were more open about seeking help, but also because the cultural script still expected them to carry invisible burdens, emotional labor, caregiving, balancing work, and family. These stresses don't show up in diagnostic manuals, but they shape women's mental health every day. And then the pandemic hit. Suddenly, everyone was anxious, and openly so. Quarantine, isolation, economic uncertainty, all of it brought anxiety front and center. Women, especially, felt the brunt. Studies showed rising rates of anxiety and depression among women balancing remote work, homeschooling, and caregiving. In a way, it echoed the old patterns. Women bearing disproportionate stress, while the solutions offered were often individualized. Download this app, try this meditation, light this candle. The big difference today is visibility. Unlike the women who were locked in bedrooms for rest cures or sedated into compliance, women now share their experiences publicly, sometimes virally. Anxiety has become a shared language, not just a medical label. And that's powerful. It means women can name what they're going through, without being dismissed as hysterical or fragile. But visibility has its own traps. Anxiety can become trendy, aestheticized, even trivialized. A pastel meme about panic attacks might get thousands of likes. But does it change the fact that healthcare systems are overloaded? Therapy is expensive, and women's stress is often rooted in systemic issues. Not really. The risk is that anxiety becomes another lifestyle brand, neatly packaged but not fully addressed. So here we are. From wandering wombs to Instagram therapy, from fumigation with herbs to Calm app subscriptions. The arc of history shows that women's anxiety has always been real, always pervasive, and always filtered through the culture of the moment. What changes isn't the anxiety itself, it's the story told about it. And today's story is complicated. Anxiety is normalized, commodified, destigmatized, aestheticized, and still deeply gendered. Women talk about it more openly than ever, but they also carry it more visibly. Society acknowledges it, but doesn't always fix the conditions that cause it, which, honestly, feels pretty on brand for history. So far, we've traced women's anxiety from ancient wandering wombs to Instagram therapy sessions. But history isn't just about ordinary women. It's also about the ones in crowns, corsets, and coronation gowns. And, honestly, royalty gave us some of the most documented misdiagnosed cases of female anxiety. Because when a queen broke down, it wasn't just personal, it was political. Take Juana of Castile, often remembered by the not-so-flattering nickname Juana la Loca. She lived in the early 1500s, married to Philip the Handsome, who was handsome in that slightly unfortunate Habsburg way. Juana adored him, but Philip was, let's just say, not great. He cheated, lied, schemed, and then, inconveniently, died young. Juana, stricken with grief and jealousy, famously refused to part with his corpse. For months, she traveled with his coffin, supposedly opening it now and then to check he was still there. Contemporaries said she was insane. Modern historians wonder if she was just severely anxious and depressed, with a touch of trauma. But because she was a queen, her emotions were treated as a crisis of state. Her father, and later her son, both used her madness as an excuse to lock her away and take control of her throne. Anxiety and grief weren't seen as human reactions, they were tools in a political chess game. Or look at Marie Antoinette. The French queen is usually remembered for cake she never actually recommended, but she also lived in a pressure cooker of public scrutiny. Every move she made was judged: how she dressed, how she smiled, even how she produced children. Anxiety wasn't exactly diagnosed in her case, but letters reveal her bouts of nerves, exhaustion, and what we'd probably call panic attacks today. But instead of sympathy, she was branded frivolous, unstable, and dangerous. A woman's visible anxiety, in a time of political unrest, was twisted into a symbol of national decay. Even queens, who were respected, weren't immune. Victoria of the United Kingdom, who gave her name to an entire era, was plagued by nerves after her husband Albert's death. She withdrew from public life for years, dressed in black, and suffered what we'd now describe as prolonged grief disorder or severe anxiety. But because she was queen, her private mourning was politicized. Some subjects saw it as devotion, others saw it as weakness. Again, her anxiety wasn't allowed to just be personal, it was interpreted through the lens of power. Then there's the quieter cases. Noble women and princesses who were described as delicate or melancholic. Often, those were polite euphemisms for anxious. A 17th century duchess who fainted too often. An 18th century countess who couldn't sleep. Their symptoms were written down, but always wrapped in cultural framing. Fragility, sensitivity, femininity. Anxiety wasn't recognized as an illness. It was turned into a character trait. What's striking is how royalty were both protected and trapped. Their wealth gave them access to doctors, tonics, and treatments. But their visibility meant every anxious sigh could be exaggerated into madness, scandal, or political liability. Ordinary women were dismissed. Queens were dissected. Neither really got understanding. And, of course, anxiety often ran in dynasties. Royal families were famously inbred, passing down not just physical traits, but also vulnerabilities to mental health struggles. The Habsburgs, the Bourbons, the Windsors all had their share of nervous royals. But instead of seeing it as genetic or situational, it was usually spun into moral judgments. Weakness, fragility, unfitness to rule. So when we talk about women's anxiety in history, it's not just medical, it's dynastic, political, and cultural. For queens, it was weaponized. For noble women, it was romanticized. For common women, it was dismissed. Same anxiety, different outcomes, depending entirely on social status. And honestly, that's one of the most consistent patterns across all of this. Anxiety has never been treated purely as a human experience. It's always been filtered through gender, class, and power. Whether you were a peasant woman in a medieval village, a housewife in 1950s suburbia, or a queen in a gilded palace, your anxiety was never just yours. It was something others defined, labeled, and very often used against you. And yet, the stories of these anxious royals are oddly comforting in a sleepy way, because they remind us that even the most powerful women in history weren't immune to feeling overwhelmed, restless, or just plain tired of it all. Anxiety has always been part of the human condition. It's the way people around it interpret it that changes. Let's float now into the 19th and 20th centuries, where royal anxiety didn't just stay inside palaces. It started leaking into newspapers, diaries, and eventually the tabloid press. Suddenly, the private nervous breakdowns of queens and princesses were public business, and the way they were framed tells us a lot about how women's anxiety was still misunderstood. Take Empress Elizabeth of Austria, better known as Sisi. She lived in the mid-1800s and was basically the Instagram influencer of her time, minus the filters. Famous for her beauty, her impossibly tiny waist, and her obsession with exercise, Sisi was adored and scrutinized in equal measure. What people didn't see, or chose not to name, was her severe anxiety. She avoided court life, dreaded social events, and spent hours walking or riding horses to calm her nerves. She obsessed over her appearance to the point of punishing regimens, strict diets, elaborate hair routines that took hours. It was all coping. Today, we might call it an anxiety disorder with obsessive tendencies. But in her era, it was seen as eccentricity. A beautiful woman with delicate nerves. Romantic, tragic, and ultimately misunderstood. Then there's Charlotte of Belgium, who married into Mexican royalty when her husband Maximilian was installed as emperor by Napoleon III. Things went downhill quickly. Revolutions, betrayals, and Maximilian's eventual execution. Charlotte, left alone, spiraled into a state of deep anxiety and paranoia. She returned to Europe and spent the next 6 decades in seclusion, often described as insane. But reading between the lines, her anxiety was a response to extraordinary trauma. Her mind simply couldn't bear the weight of everything collapsing. Instead of empathy, she was remembered as the Mad Empress. Fast forward to the 20th century, and we get a whole new wave of anxious royals. And this time, the press was watching. Princess Diana is the clearest example. By the 1980s, the British monarchy had mastered the art of spectacle, and Diana was the star. But behind the glamorous photos and fairy tale wedding, she struggled with intense anxiety, eating disorders, and depression. She openly admitted to feeling trapped, overwhelmed, and constantly under pressure to present perfection. The response, a mix of sympathy and judgment. She was called unstable, too emotional, even dangerous to the monarchy. Sound familiar? It's basically the Juana of Castile playbook, just updated with paparazzi. Diana's anxiety was human, but the way it was weaponized, both by the press and within the royal family, made it something bigger. It wasn't just her problem. It was framed as a crisis for the entire institution. And let's not forget Paula Simpson, the American whose marriage to Edward VIII triggered his abdication. She wasn't a queen, but she lived under the crown's shadow. Letters and memoirs suggest she dealt with frequent anxiety, insomnia, and nerves, especially under the weight of public hatred. The press painted her as cold and scheming, but behind that image was a woman constantly described by friends as tense, exhausted, and chain-smoking to calm her nerves. By the late 20th century, psychiatry had more language for anxiety, but the cultural framing hadn't changed much for royals. Anxiety was still seen through the lens of public duty. A nervous princess wasn't just a woman having panic attacks. She was a liability, a symbol, a headline. Her anxiety was always about more than her. And even now, in the 21st century, modern royals aren't immune. Meghan Markle, for example, has spoken openly about anxiety and depression during her time as Duchess of Sussex. The tabloids responded with predictable cruelty, spinning her openness into weakness or manipulation. Different century, same script. What all of this shows is that anxiety among royal women has always been a mirror. It reflects not just their own struggles, but the expectations society places on women in visible roles. Ordinary women could be dismissed as hysterical or fragile. Queens and princesses, their anxiety became a spectacle, a political crisis, or a cultural morality tale. And yet, in their own quiet ways, these women reveal something universal. Anxiety isn't about class, wealth, or power. It's about being human. And if even women surrounded by diamonds and palaces couldn't escape it, maybe it's a little comforting. It means that anxiety has always been part of the story, no matter how gilded the setting. By the late 20th century, women weren't just in homes or palaces anymore. They were in offices, classrooms, laboratories, and political halls. But here's the catch. Their anxiety didn't stay at home either. It followed them into these new spaces. And of course, society found creative new ways to misunderstand it. Let's start with the workplace. In the 1970s and 80s, as more women entered professional jobs, there was a lot of talk about the so-called nervous woman employee. Newspapers, workplace manuals, even corporate memos sometimes framed female workers as more emotional, more prone to breakdowns, or less able to handle stress. Basically, if a man slammed a door, he was decisive under pressure. If a woman did the same, she was too anxious for leadership, double standards, alive and well. And yet, ironically, workplaces were causing plenty of anxiety. Women were juggling expectations. Be professional, but also be pleasant. Work hard, but don't outshine men. Stay ambitious, but don't neglect family. It was like a constant tightrope walk with no safety net. Anxiety wasn't an overreaction. It was a natural response to impossible demands. Universities weren't much different. Female students in the mid-20th century often reported high anxiety, but counselors framed it in ways that reinforced old stereotypes. Some advice books literally suggested that anxious young women were simply worried about finding husbands. Forget the stress of exams, financial burdens, or discrimination. No. Clearly their nerves came from romantic uncertainty, because obviously a woman's brain was just a side note to her dating life. By the 1980s and 90s, psychology research began to catch up. Studies showed that women consistently reported higher rates of anxiety disorders than men. The data was real, but the interpretation was not always flattering. Some researchers leaned into biological explanations, painting women's brains as simply wired for more anxiety. Others suggested hormones were the culprit, circling back to the age-old idea that women's biology made them emotionally unstable. At the same time, self-help culture exploded. Bookstores filled with guides on how to manage nerves, stress, and female worries. Some were helpful, many were patronizing. A lot of them boiled down to, eat better, breathe deeply, and stop overthinking, which, sure, fine advice, but maybe a little simplistic when the actual problem was systemic sexism, workplace barriers, and centuries of being told to smile through the panic. And then came the superwoman ideal of the 80s and 90s. Women were told they could have it all: career, family, social life, personal growth. The glossy magazines showed smiling women in power suits holding babies while stirring casseroles. What they didn't show were the anxiety attacks in the bathroom stalls, the insomnia, or the antidepressant prescriptions quietly written by doctors. Anxiety wasn't vanishing. It was just being hidden behind shoulder pads and bright lipstick. Even medicine had blind spots. Doctors in the 80s and 90s often prescribed tranquilizers or antidepressants to women at higher rates than men. Sometimes that was appropriate. Sometimes it was just an easy way to smooth over symptoms without asking deeper questions. Anxiety was still treated as an individual flaw more than a social condition. And if women tried to push back, insisting that the problem wasn't just their nerves, but the culture suffocating them, they were often dismissed as overreacting. Again, it's worth noting, though, that the late 20th century did bring some progress. Feminist scholars and activists started critiquing psychiatry itself, pointing out how diagnoses had long been used to police women's behavior. Books like The Yellow Wallpaper, a century earlier, suddenly felt freshly relevant. And some therapists began to reframe anxiety not as a weakness, but as a signal, a perfectly human reaction to an environment that wasn't T-built to support women. So, by the time the 1990s closed, women's anxiety had finally been named, measured, and researched, but it still wasn't truly understood. In offices, it was a liability. In universities, it was trivialized. In medicine, it was overprescribed. The same old patterns, just dressed up in modern language. The bigger picture remained the same. Anxiety wasn't just inside women. It was in the structures around them. The nerves weren't irrational. They were logical. And yet, most of the time, the burden was still placed on women to calm down, cope better, or medicate. The system rarely asked how it might need to change. By the early 2000s, women's anxiety had officially entered a new phase. It wasn't just a medical diagnosis anymore. It was a lifestyle category. And in true 21st century fashion, it was something you could market, monetize, and hashtag. Let's start with the basics. The numbers kept climbing. Studies showed anxiety disorders were more commonly diagnosed in women than men. The reasons: a mix of biology, social pressures, and cultural scripts. But instead of digging into the messy details, the mainstream conversation often boiled it down to, women are just more anxious. Which, is a pretty lazy explanation. Meanwhile, technology arrived to pour gasoline on the fire. Social media platforms turned comparison into a full-time job. Suddenly, women weren't just juggling real-life expectations. They were also curating online identities. Every selfie, every outfit, every moment of parenting or working or existing was measured against endless streams of polished images. Anxiety wasn't just internal anymore. It was on display, visible in the tiny cracks between posts. And here's the twist: companies noticed. Entered the era of wellness marketing. Anxiety became a gold mine. Essential oils, weighted blankets, mindfulness apps, herbal teas, Instagram influencers holding crystal zit was all packaged as the cure to modern nerves. Instead of doctors prescribing mother's little helpers, now you had brands prescribing lavender-scented candles for $60 a pop. It wasn't that these things were useless. Some genuinely helped. But the larger trend was the same old story. Anxiety was turned into a consumer problem. Your nerves weren't a signal that maybe society was overwhelming, exploitative, or unsustainable. No. It just meant you needed the right self-care products. And if you couldn't afford them, well, maybe that's why you're still anxious. Therapy also shifted. By the 2000s and 2010s, therapy became more normalized, especially for women. Shows like Girls and Insecure made anxiety relatable, almost fashionable. Young women could talk openly about panic attacks, insomnia, or social anxiety without as much stigma. Progress, for sure. But therapy also became part of the branding machine. There were therapy-inspired merch lines, memes, and even TikTok trends about high-functioning anxiety. The condition was real, but it was also being packaged into quirky content. And then there were the medications. SSR, like Prozac, Zoloft, and Lexapro became household names. Unlike the tranquilizers of the 1950s, these weren't marketed exclusively to women, but prescriptions still skewed female. On the bright side, many women found real relief. On the not-so-bright side, pharma companies still had a habit of overselling cures without addressing systemic causes. Pills worked, yes, but they didn't magically erase toxic workplaces, economic precarity, or the impossible pressures of modern womanhood. By the 2010s, another cultural shift had landed. The hashtag self-care movement, which started as a radical idea, especially in black feminist writing, where self-care meant survival, was quickly diluted into bubble baths and face masks. Anxiety became another thing to soothe away with retail therapy. Buy a jade roller, light a candle, do a 5-minute meditation, and congratulations, you've treated centuries of gendered pressure. Social media made all of this louder. On one hand, women could finally find communities online where anxiety was openly discussed. Forums, blogs, and later Instagram accounts gave space for shared experiences. On the other hand, constant exposure to other people's anxiety stories sometimes created an echo chamber. Women weren't just anxious, they were anxious about being anxious. And here we are today, in an age where women's anxiety is everywhere. On podcasts, in TikTok skits, in self-help books, with pastel covers. The good news, it's finally recognized as real, valid, and worth addressing. The bad news, it's also commodified, trivialized, and occasionally mocked. 1,000 years after Wandering Wombs, the framing has changed, but the struggle remains familiar. Because under all the branding, the weighted blankets, and the meditation apps, the truth is simple. Anxiety isn't a trend. It's a deeply human response to stress, pressure, and vulnerability. And women, thanks to centuries of unequal expectations, just happen to get more of it. What's remarkable, maybe even comforting, is that across time, from ancient queens to suburban housewives to modern Instagram users, the patterns repeat. Anxiety never really went away. It just kept being renamed, repackaged, and resold. And if that sounds a little bleak, well, it also means you're not alone. You're part of a very, very long history of women who sighed, worried, and carried on. So, let's take a slow breath here and notice just how far we've drifted. From ancient Egypt and Greece, to medieval convents, Renaissance palaces, Victorian drawing rooms, 1950s kitchens, and now TikTok confessionals. Women's anxiety has worn a lot of costumes, but the underlying story has stayed strangely the same. Every age has given it a different label. Wandering womb, melancholy, hysteria, neurasthenia, nervous breakdown, panic disorder, high-functioning anxiety. Each one sounds like progress, but really, it's just a new name on the same restless feeling. And usually, the label says more about the society handing it out than about the women themselves. Ancient doctors thought anxiety was a womb gone rogue. Medieval monks saw it as spiritual weakness. Enlightenment physicians medicalized it into a diagnosis. Victorian husbands used it to control their wives. 20th century advertisers used it to sell pills and appliances. 21st century influencers use it to sell yoga mats and productivity apps. Different centuries, same game. And here's the ironic part. Throughout history, women weren't just passive patients. They were also observers. Writers, diarists, poets. They all left behind hints of their inner worlds. the nun scribbling about her dark nights of the soul, the queen writing anxious letters to her children, the 1950s housewife keeping a secret journal of tranquilizer use, the millennial posting about panic attacks between selfies. If you string them together, you get a chorus that stretches across centuries. A very quiet, but very persistent chorus. Of course, history rarely treated it that way. Instead, it sliced these women into case studies, cautionary tales, or punchlines. Juana of Castile became the Mad Queen. Charlotte of Belgium was locked away as insane. Sisi of Austria was exoticized into a tragic beauty. Princess Diana was branded unstable by tabloids. Meghan Markle was framed as overly sensitive, and countless ordinary women, whose names we'll never know, were told to calm down, lie down, pray harder, or take their pills. Yet, there's something oddly comforting about this continuity. Because it means anxiety isn't a flaw in you, or in any individual woman. It's a universal thread. A reaction to pressure, loss, and expectation. The same nerves that shook a medieval abbess might echo in a college student before finals. The same insomnia that haunted an empress might live in the scrolling habits of someone lying awake with their phone at 3 a.m. And that makes history a little less abstract. It's not just kings and wars and treaties. It's also women sitting in their rooms, quietly overwhelmed, trying to steady their breathing. That part of the human story rarely made it into textbooks, but it was always there, hidden in footnotes, buried in medical manuals, hinted at in poetry, a ghost in the margins, waiting to be noticed. The question now, of course, is whether we've really learned. Modern medicine understands more about the brain. Therapy is more accessible. Conversations about mental health are more open, but the old habits dismissing women's nerves, packaging their struggles into consumer fixes, framing their anxiety as a moral flaw haven't completely vanished. They've just updated their vocabulary. So maybe the lesson isn't that anxiety will ever go away. It's that the way we frame it matters. Are we dismissing it, romanticizing it, selling it? Or are we listening? Because the difference between being called hysterical and being called human is just how society chooses to see you. And if history has anything to offer here, it's perspective. That anxious sigh you let out at work, that tightness in your chest before speaking in public, that restless scrolling at midnight. None of it is new. Women have been there before. You queens, housewives, students, writers, rebels, you're not alone in it. You're part of a long, weary, strangely united lineage. So here we are, at the end of a long drift through centuries of sighs, nerves, fainting couches, and late-night worries. If you've somehow stayed awake all the way through, well, congratulations. But if you've dozed off halfway, that's perfectly fine. Honestly, that's kind of the point. What we've seen is that women's anxiety has never really been just a personal struggle. It's always been wrapped up in whatever stories society wanted to tell about women at the time. In ancient Greece, it was the womb misbehaving. In the Middle Ages, it was spiritual weakness. In the Enlightenment, it was delicate nerves. In the Victorian era, it was hysteria and fainting. In the 1950s, it was a housewife's little problem. In the 21st century, it's a wellness brand with pastel-colored packaging. Each generation thought it was being scientific or modern, but mostly, it was repeating the same cycle. Dismiss, label, medicate, market. The names change, the treatments change, but the pattern of misunderstanding stays strangely familiar. And yet, there's another thread running through all of it. The women themselves. The anxious queens who wrote shaky letters. The nuns who prayed through their fears. The housewives who secretly swallowed pills. The students who scribbled in diaries. The modern voices on blogs, podcasts, and TikTok. Together, they form a hidden archive of human feeling. It's quiet, but it stretches across centuries. What's interesting is how often anxiety was turned into a flaw-proof, that a woman was weak, unstable, or unfit. But what if we flip that around? Anxiety is, at its core, awareness, sensitivity to pressure, recognition that something feels wrong. Maybe the very thing dismissed as weakness was actually a form of strength, a refusal to be numbed completely by impossible expectations. Of course, that's not how history framed it. But lying here in the calm of night, it's easier to imagine it differently. To see Juana of Castile not as mad, but as devastated. To see Sissy of Austria not as eccentric, but as overwhelmed. To see Diana not as unstable, but as suffocated. To see the countless unnamed women not as hysterical, but as human. And that's where this long, winding story settles. Anxiety isn't a historical mistake or a personal flaw. It's simply part of being alive, especially under the weight of systems that demand silence, compliance, or perfection. Women felt it centuries ago. Women feel it now. And chances are, women will feel it centuries from now. The difference lies in how we choose to understand it. So if you're listening in the dark, maybe with your eyes already heavy, take this last thought with you. Your anxiety isn't new, strange, or shameful. It's ancient, it's royal, it's ordinary. It's part of a long, tired, deeply human story. And in some strange way, that makes it less lonely. Now, let's let the history rest for tonight. Close your eyes, slow your breathing, and let yourself sink into the quiet. The anxious queens, the nervous housewives, the restless students, they've carried their stories this far. You don't need to carry them any further right now. Just let the night hold them, and let yourself drift. Even after psychiatry officially moved past the word hysteria, the ghost of that diagnosis hung around like an old perfume you can't quite wash out of the curtains. Doctors stopped writing hysterical female on charts, sure, but instead they wrote nervous disposition or neurotic tendencies, or just quietly prescribed something in a neat little amber bottle. In many ways, the word nerves took over. Everyone in the early 20th century seemed to have weak nerves, nervous exhaustion, nervous headaches, nervous stomachs. If you were wealthy, you might be sent to a rest cure at a sanatorium in Switzerland, which usually meant long walks, plain food, and maybe a daily mineral bath. If you were middle class, you might just buy a tonic syrup full of alcohol and cocaine, which surprise made you feel better, at least until it wore off. For women though, nerves still carried a heavy undertone. Men could have nerves because they worked too hard or fought in a war. Women, however, were assumed to have nerves because of their nature. Too emotional, too fragile, too impressionable, which meant that their anxiety still wasn't seen as a rational response to stress. It was simply who they were. Let's take Virginia Woolf as an example. The famous writer suffered from deep bouts of depression and anxiety. Her diaries describe periods of trembling, sleeplessness, and what she called the terror. Doctors labeled her condition nerves and alternated between recommending complete bed rest or sternly telling her to get on with things. Woolf herself often doubted whether her illness was real or just a form of weakness. That doubt, the constant second-guessing, was itself a form of torture, and she wasn't alone. Countless women at the turn of the century wrote letters to doctors, family members, or private journals describing their nervous attacks. Some fainted in public. Some suffered panic at night. Some developed obsessive habits. Most were told not to worry. Or worse, they were told not to think, because that was the strange paradox. Society wanted women to be decorative and calm. But it also suspected that too much thinking was dangerous. Reading novels, overstimulating, writing too much, damaging to the nerves. Education, risky for fragile female brains. And so, anxiety often became the excuse to push women back into silence. What's fascinating is how the cultural script kept looping. The label changed, but the core idea stayed steady. Women's anxiety was never about the world. It was about them, their bodies, their minds, their supposed flaws. Whether it was the womb wandering around, or the nerves being too delicate, or the hormones running wild, the pattern remained the same. And yet, beneath all of that, we can still glimpse the real lives of these women, the private fears scribbled in a diary, the small rebellions of refusing a medicine, the whispered conversations late at night. These quiet traces remind us that anxiety wasn't just a medical category. It was lived, it was felt, it was endured. So maybe tonight, as we sit with this endless trail of anxious queens, duchesses, housewives, and students, we can see them not as medical curiosities, but as companions across time. Their nerves, their worries, their late-night fears, they echo softly in our own restless nights. And in that sense, their history never really ends. When you think about the early 20th century and women's anxiety, you almost can't avoid Sigmund Freud. The man built half a career on listening to women describe their fears, then telling them it was all about their fathers, which, is one way to interpret things. Freud called it hysteria, but his version was less about a wandering womb and more about suppressed desires and unconscious conflicts. Still, the patients were often the same. Middle and upper class women, nervous, anxious, sometimes unable to speak, sometimes fainting, sometimes paralyzed with no physical cause. They came into his Vienna office, lay down on the couch, and told him stories of childhood fears, strict parents, unhappy marriages, or repressed grief. And instead of saying, "Yeah, life sounds hard, no wonder you're anxious," Freud went deeper. He framed it all as hidden trauma, forbidden desires, and unresolved complexes. For his patients, this could feel validating. They weren't weak, they were complicated. On the other hand, it also meant that every symptom pointed back to some supposed sexual repression, which wasn't always helpful when what they really needed was probably a supportive ear, not a lecture on the Oedipus complex. One of Freud's most famous case studies was Dora, a young woman who came to him with coughing fits, fainting, and depression. She described being harassed by a family friend, ignored by her parents, and trapped in a suffocating household. Freud's analysis: she must have had secret desires for the man who harassed her. Unsurprisingly, Dora didn't stick around for long. She walked out of therapy after just 11 weeks. Can't blame her. Then there was Anna O., whose real name was Bertha Panheim. She suffered from hallucinations, paralysis, and severe anxiety, treated by Freud's colleague, Joseph Breuer. She called the therapy the talking cure. Just speaking out loud about her fears and memories seemed to help. In many ways, Anna O. paved the way for modern psychotherapy. But her personal life, she went on to become a social worker and feminist activist, suggesting she needed meaning and agency more than endless analysis. These cases are revealing. On the surface, they look like medical history. But underneath, they read stories of women trying to find language for their anxiety in a world that didn't really want to hear it. They had to fit their suffering into the categories available at the time: hysteria, nerves, psychoanalysis. Yet between the lines, you can still hear their real voices, lonely, restless, looking for recognition. And then, beyond the consulting room, society kept humming the same old tune. Women with anxiety were seen as delicate. Women with breakdowns were hidden away in women with panic or depression were dosed with morphine, barbiturates, or chlorohydrate. The medical details changed, but the framing stayed the same. Their anxiety was a symptom of being women. Freud and his colleagues gave this old pattern a new vocabulary. Instead of wombs or nerves, it was unconscious drives. Instead of fainting spells, it was repression. Instead of a wandering uterus, it was a father fixation. But to the women lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, it probably felt much the same. The world didn't take their anxiety as seriously as their reality demanded. So we drift forward, past Freud's couch, and into the wider 20th century, where psychiatry and pharmaceuticals start reshaping the story all over again. By the middle of the 20th century, women's anxiety had a new costume. It wasn't fainting in lace gowns or lying on Freud's couch anymore. It was slipping a small white pill into the mouth before folding laundry, before setting dinner on the table, before smiling at a husband who didn't notice the effort. Doctors had discovered tranquilizers. First came barbiturates, then the supposedly safer benzodiazepines like Librium in the 1950s and Valium in the 1960s. These pills promised to soothe frazzled nerves, calm racing hearts, and make everyday stress melt into a pleasant fog. And who, according to the ads, needed this most? Housewives. You can find the old magazine spreads. A weary woman in pearls, one hand on her forehead, the other holding a child. The tagline would say something like, "You can cope again, thanks to Librium," or a smiling hostess at a dinner party with the not-so-subtle implication that her good mood was chemically assisted. It was elegant, modern, scientific. Anxiety wasn't a failing anymore. It was a prescription away from being invisible. The irony was sharp. Women had been told for centuries that their anxiety came from their wombs, or their nerves, or their weak minds. Now, in the sleek age of advertising, they were told the same thing in different words. It was their biology, their role, their inability to relax without help. And instead of fainting couches, they got pharmacies. But the anxiety itself, that hadn't changed. Women were still trapped in suffocating domestic roles, expected to smile endlessly through monotony and pressure. Many wrote in private about feeling empty, restless, unseen. Depression and panic simmered beneath the surface of spotless kitchens. And instead of being taken seriously, they were medicated into silence. The Rolling Stones would later immortalize the idea with the phrase, "Mother's little helper," a small pill to keep the house tidy, the children quiet, and the mask of composure firmly in place. Doctors handed them out like candy. By the late 1960s, Valium was the single most prescribed drug in America. Millions of women swallowed their anxiety away each day, not because it solved their problems, but because it dulled them just enough to keep functioning. Some women welcomed it, others grew dependent. A few quietly resisted, refusing the pills and instead finding outlets in activism, writing, or simply admitting that something deeper was wrong. That undercurrent, women questioning the system itself, was one of the quiet seeds of second-wave feminism. Because if all these women were anxious, maybe the problem wasn't in their heads. Maybe it was in the roles they'd been forced into. Looking back, the image is almost surreal. Mid-century America, with its gleaming cars and suburban lawns, also floating on a haze of sedatives. The anxious housewife, smiling faintly at the dinner table, her nerves chemically smoothed. Anxiety had become not just a personal feeling, but a consumer product. And once again, women were the main market. So as we move through the 20th century, the story shifts again. From fainting couches to prescriptions, from Freud's lectures to television commercials. The core pattern stays the same. Women's anxiety is noticed, but rarely understood. And that's where we'll drift next. Into the late 20th century, where therapy, medication, and feminism start colliding, and women's anxiety begins to be named in new ways, though never without a shadow of the old labels. By the 1970s, cracks were starting to show in the shiny Valium culture. Magazines began running about, housewives hooked on tranquilizers. Feminist writers pointed out the obvious. Maybe women weren't anxious because their brains were broken. Maybe they were anxious because they were trapped in roles that didn't allow for freedom, ambition, or even basic respect. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique had already dropped the bomb in 1963, calling it the problem that has no name. Women across the suburbs were quietly panicking, crying in bathrooms, and feeling empty despite having everything. The diagnosis wasn't hysteria anymore. It wasn't nerves. It was the suffocating weight of being told that your only purpose was cooking, cleaning, and smiling. And so, in the 1970s, a new language began to emerge. Anxiety wasn't just a personal flaw. It could be political. It could be cultural. The feminist movement reframed the conversation. The system itself was producing anxious women, then selling them pills to keep them quiet. You didn't need another tranquilizer. You needed liberation. Of course, psychiatry didn't vanish. In fact, it kept evolving. The late 1980s brought what was called the Prozac revolution. Unlike Valium, which dulled the edges, Prozac promised to lift the fog, rebalance the brain, and let you function without sedation. Suddenly, depression and anxiety weren't character flaws. They were chemical imbalances. And that framing was oddly liberating. For many women, Prozac felt like a miracle. They described color returning to life, energy seeping back into their days. Unlike earlier drugs, Prozac didn't carry the same stigma of dependency. It was modern. It was sleek. You weren't a weak housewife anymore. You were a professional woman, managing your health with science. But it wasn't just medication shaping the era. The rise of therapy, especially cognitive behavioral therapy, gave women practical tools, challenged the anxious thought, reshaped the pattern, practiced control. It was less mystical than Freud, less numbing than tranquilizers. And in many cases, it worked. At the same time, the booming self-help industry began plastering bookshelves with titles like Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. Anxiety became something you could read about, journal about, workshop about. Oprah interviews, talk shows, and glossy covers in the checkout aisle all promised new ways to tame the restless mind. Of course, even this came with contradictions. Women were told to empower themselves, but also to keep consuming. Buy the new book, try the new program, take the new supplement. The marketplace had discovered that anxiety wasn't just a medical problem. It was a lifestyle category, and women were still the main audience. Looking back, the 1970s through 1990s feels like a hinge. Anxiety shifted from a hushed secret to a public conversation, from fainting spells and hidden pills to open talk about panic attacks and depression. From doctors dismissing women as hysterical to doctors prescribing Prozac with a sense of hope. But the cultural undertone never quite disappeared. Women were still more likely than men to be diagnosed with anxiety disorders. They were still more likely to be prescribed medication. And even with feminism, they were still more likely to be told that their feelings were too much. So, as the 20th century wound down, women's anxiety had become both more visible and more medicalized. It was spoken about, it was treated, it was even marketed. But the core question why women carried so much of it was still left mostly unanswered. And that's where we drift into the modern day, where Instagram therapists, mindfulness apps, and pastel-colored anxiety journals all compete with centuries of ghosts still whispering the word hysteria. By the early 2000s, anxiety was no longer a hushed secret or a medical oddity. It was everywhere. The language of panic attacks, social anxiety, and generalized anxiety disorder slipped into everyday speech. College students casually said, "That gives me anxiety." Celebrities admitted their struggles in interviews. Oprah, of course, hosted entire specials about it. In one sense, this was progress. For centuries, women's anxiety had been silenced, pathologized, or dismissed as hysteria. Now, at least, people were saying the word out loud. Therapy became normal. Medication was openly discussed. Even workplace HR departments started handing out pamphlets about stress management. But with visibility came a new twist, commodification. Suddenly, anxiety wasn't just something to be treated. It was something to be branded. Wellness companies rushed in with essential oil diffusers, weighted blankets, mindfulness apps, and monthly subscription boxes promising .com. Everything had soft fonts, pastel colors, and gentle slogans like "You deserve peace." And of course, most of it was marketed squarely at women. Social media amplified this in strange ways. On one side, platforms like Instagram and TikTok became places where women openly shared their experiences. Panic spirals, insomnia, intrusive thoughts, hashtags like #anxiety and #mental health awareness created a kind of digital support group. It was raw, relatable, and often reassuring. But at the same time, these platforms fed the very thing they claimed to soothe. Scrolling endlessly through curated images of perfect lives didn't exactly calm the nervous system. Influencers posed with lavender teas and journal spreads while quietly editing out their own panic. The result was a surreal loop. Women went online to seek relief from anxiety, but often found more of it waiting for them. Even therapy itself became an app. Companies promised you could text a counselor at 2 a.m. or log into a 10-minute guided meditation between Zoom calls. Helpful, sometimes, but also a reminder that anxiety had become a product you could download like Spotify or Uber Eats. The irony isn't lost here. For centuries, women's anxiety was medicalized in ways that erased its context. Wombs, nerves, hormones. Now, in the digital age, it's commodified in ways that also risk erasing the context. Buy the right candle, download the right app, sip the right herbal latte, and you'll be fine. But the bigger questions about overwork, loneliness, inequality, or trauma often get glossed over in favor of self-care with a price tag. That's not to say there's no progress. Compared to the past, women today can at least name their anxiety without being accused of witchcraft, hysteria, or weakness. They can find online communities, read research, access treatments that actually work. They can say, "I have anxiety," and be met with understanding rather than disbelief. Still, the pattern lingers. Women remain more likely to be diagnosed, more likely to be medicated, and more likely to have their symptoms minimized. The ghosts of hysteria and nerves hover quietly behind the modern hashtags. So in this early 21st century landscape, anxiety lives in two forms at once. As a real, lived experience that women share more openly than ever before, and as a shiny product that companies are eager to package and sell back to them. It's both empowerment and exploitation, freedom and commercialization, healing and branding. And if that feels confusing, well, anxiety has always thrived in contradictions. That's its historical rhythm. If you look at the modern landscape of women's anxiety, it feels both brand new and oddly familiar. The vocabulary has shifted. We don't talk about hysteria anymore. Doctors don't warn about wandering wombs. And yet, the treatments offered often sit in the same old pattern: soothe, silence, normalize. On one side, you've got medication. SSR is like Prozac, Zoloft, Lix. They're the children of Valium and Librium, marketed not as tranquilizers, but as correctors of brain chemistry. And for many, they work. Millions of women today take them daily, finding genuine relief from panic, dread, or sleepless nights. Unlike the housewives of the 1960s, they don't have to hide it. They can talk openly about being on meds, share side effects in forums, swap notes with friends. In some ways, that's revolutionary. But then again, the pattern remains. Women are still more likely than men to be prescribed these drugs, often in quick appointments where the deeper roots of their anxiety, workplace discrimination, caregiving burdens, financial stress, aren't really addressed. Pills are easier than restructuring society. And so, the medicalization continues, just with better branding. On another side, you've got therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction, trauma-informed counseling. For many women, this feels like a break from the past. Not just being told to rest or swallow something, but being given actual tools to reshape thought patterns, journaling, breathing exercises, reframing. The talking cure that Anna O described has grown up into structured, evidence-based methods. And then there's mindfulness, the modern darling of anxiety treatment. Meditations on YouTube.com, voices on apps, breathing guides that ping you at its best. Mindfulness really does help ground the anxious body. At its worst, it gets sold like a scented candle. Just another product in a world already overflowing with soft pastel promises. The most interesting break from the past is probably community. Women today can talk about their anxiety without whispering. They can post on TikTok about panic attacks. They can form Discord groups, podcasts, newsletters. That sense of solidarity, that you're not alone, that your fear isn't strange, is something historical women rarely had. Juana of Castile didn't have a Empress Sisi didn't have a wellness blog. Princess Diana didn't have an anxiety support group with strangers from across the world. And yet, even here, echoes remain. Social media makes anxiety visible, yes, but it also creates new anxieties. Comparison, overstimulation, constant connectivity. The nervous system that once trembled under corsets and fainting couches now trembles under notifications and endless scrolling. Same nerves, new triggers. So in the 21st century, women's anxiety sits at a crossroads. It's destigmatized, treated, researched, named, but it's also packaged, commodified, and sometimes flattened into a lifestyle brand. The ghosts of hysteria haven't vanished. They've just learned to blend into hashtags and self-care kits. And maybe that the quiet truth running beneath all of it. Women's anxiety has never been about a single cause or a single cure. It's a mirror of the pressures around them. In ancient Greece, it was the womb. In Victorian England, it was repression. In the 1950s, it was domestic captivity. In the 2000s, it's burnout and overstimulation. Different worlds, same restless pulse. When you trace this long, winding history of women's anxiety, from ancient temples to modern therapy apps, one pattern keeps shimmering through. Anxiety is never just an inner state. It's also a mirror of the society around it. In ancient Greece, the womb supposedly wandered because women weren't trusted with independence. In the Middle Ages, anxiety was a spiritual flaw because religion wanted obedience and silence. In the Enlightenment, it was fragile nerves because women were expected to be decorative, not serious. In the Victorian era, it was hysteria because women were tightly corseted into impossible roles. In the 20th century, it was housewife's nerves, dulled with Valium. And today, it's burnout and overthinking, soothed with therapy, pills, or wellness products sold through Instagram ads. Each generation dressed the same feeling in different clothes, but the anxious body remained the same. Short of breath, trembling, restless, sleepless. That consistency is almost comforting. It means the women of the past were not so different from the women of now. Their letters, diaries, fainting spells, and whispered prayers feel like echoes of modern text messages, journal entries, and late-night internet searches. The tragic part is how rarely these women were believed. For centuries, their anxiety was minimized, mocked, or weaponized against them. Juana of Castile was locked away as mad. Virginia Woolf doubted her own reality. Housewives in the 1960s were told their tears were a weakness to be medicated, not a signal of deeper emptiness. Even today, women reporting anxiety in clinics sometimes hear, "It's just stress. You'll be fine." And yet, the story is not only tragic, there's resilience hidden in it, too. Women found ways to endure, to describe, to resist. Some wrote novels, some painted, some prayed, some built movements. Anxiety, for them, wasn't just a symptom. It was also a signal that something in their world was wrong. And sometimes, it pushed them to change it. Maybe that's the real thread. Women's anxiety is both personal and political, both body and society, both weakness and strength. It tells us about hormones and nerves, yes, but it also tells us about patriarchy, expectations, silences, and the weight of being asked to carry too much with too little recognition. Seen this way, the history of anxiety is not just a medical archive. It's a cultural diary, a record of pressures that never made it into official histories of kings and battles. While chroniclers wrote about wars and treaties, women were quietly writing the story of sleepless nights, skipped breaths, restless thoughts, and in the softest way, maybe that history belongs to us all. Because anxiety isn't just female, and it isn't just historical. It's human. It connects us across centuries. From a queen pacing her chambers to a student staring at her glowing phone screen at 3 a.m. Both are wide awake, feeling too much, wishing they could quiet their minds. That, more than anything, is the great continuity. Anxiety never really vanishes. It changes shape, wears new names, hides in new corners. But it's always there, woven into the texture of human life, and especially into the stories of women. So here we are, at the quiet end of a long trail. We've wandered through temples where wandering wombs were feared, and through palaces where queens were called hysterical. We've sat in candlelit parlors with fainting couches, and in doctors' offices where prescriptions were scribbled out like candy. We've listened to women whisper their restless nights into diaries, and to doctors explain away their pain with confident nonsense. And what have we really found? Maybe just that anxiety has always been there. It wore the mask of demons in one age, fragile nerves in another, hysteria in yet another. But under all the shifting explanations, the same pulse remained. That flutter of dread, that restlessness, that searching for calm. It's a strangely human thread. When Juana of Castile paced in her confinement, when Virginia Woolf scribbled late into the night, when an anonymous Victorian housewife cried quietly into her pillow, they were all, in their own times, living out a version of something that still happens tonight. Somewhere, someone is wide awake, scrolling, sighing, wondering why their mind won't quiet. History doesn't really cure that, but it does remind us that we're not alone in it. An anxious person now is linked to anxious souls centuries ago, all the way back to women in ancient temples begging for relief from a womb that never actually wandered. And in that odd way, maybe there's comfort. To know the feeling is old, to know it's been survived, endured, sometimes even turned into art or change. To know that those sleepless queens, those nervous wives, those restless poets, were all part of the same long, fragile story. So, as the night deepens, let's leave them there. Still fainting, still writing, still pacing, still breathing. Their worries belonged to them. Ours belonged to us. But the echo is shared. If you've made it all the way here, thank you for drifting through this with me. I hope it was calming, even if the history itself wasn't always kind. And maybe, before your eyes finally close, just remember, anxiety isn't proof of weakness. It's just proof that you're human, and in history, that has always been more than enough. Good night.